it's still pretty similar, but what I had him on was, you would do a squat like week 1, week 2 would be a deadlift. Week 3 might be a different squat variation, or you could even maybe do the same squat, but with chains or something like that. You're training basically all of your weak points. There's no position that you're going to be weak in. You're doing wide stance, you're doing close stance, you're using chains. And so that kind of goes back to, how do we get people to improve without spending 60 minutes in the gym doing squats? And the way to do that is to provide a lot of variation so that people always have something that they can improve on.
So in terms of that, I think relaxation is the single most underappreciated element of athleticism just out there right now. And if you watch any elite guy, whether it's Usain Bolt in the 100 meters, Jonathan Edwards in the triple jumper, Jan Zalesny in the javelin throw, the one thing they all have in common are elite levels of relaxation, where they drive the movement proximally and the energy transfers outwards through their limbs through that relaxation. And, I think looking at it from that lens of energy transfer instead of, force production of the limbs explains a lot of their elite level performances.
That was Grant Fowler and Kevin Foster. You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Before we get to the show today, I wanted to mention a really cool item that is available now from our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, in their store. That item is Exogen Premium Wearable Resistance. Exogen is a series of tight-fitting sleeves along with uniquely shaped fusiform weights that strap directly onto those sleeves. So what I mean is you can have shin sleeves, arm sleeves, shorts, and a vest, and you can strap these uniquely fusiform shaped weights. They're light in nature, 100, 200 grams, that strap on in a way that allows you not only to resist movement very specifically, but also add fine-tuned elements of rotation to that resistance. So this is the next level of wearable resistance. You may have heard this from back long ago on the show, Hank Kreinhoff talking about it, to recently Chris Korfist, sprint coach, talking about it. This is the next level in premium wearable resistance. I've used it myself. I love it. I love not only the way it feels and the way you feel form and technique change. It's like combining technique with power. And so often we just think about weighted vests as just pure force, pure downward gravity loaded resistance. This is the ultimate combination of technique with power, and it shows up in things like Chris Korfist being able to take time off an athlete's 10-meter fly by putting the sleeves just on one side of the body, an ipsilateral resistance. We're using the body's own systems, fine-tuning it, and that's what this does. It allows you as the coach or an athlete to create, explore, and fine-tune the way that the resistance is rotationally impacting the body. This is next level stuff, and I know you'll love it. So you can check that out in the Simply Faster store. Head on over to simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com, and get your Exogen gear today. Hey, everybody. It is awesome to have you guys here for another show. So the seeds of this particular episode with Kevin Foster and Grant Fowler was a comment that Kevin Foster made to me a while back. And we were talking about a little bit about some training concepts and his javelin training for the 2020 and now 2021 Olympic trials. And Kevin had mentioned how when he got onto Grant Foster's weight training program, that so many of his performance markers had just exploded, not only in weights, but also his dynamic performance and some things that he was seeing in, at the time, his short approach javelin throws. And we'll get into more of that later in the show. But long story short, Kevin was getting some awesome results getting onto Grant Fowler's weight training program. I really love doing case studies and not just talking philosophy, which we certainly do on this show, but getting into the nuts and bolts and what were you doing for training? What are you doing now? How did that change things? Those are the conversations that are so often needed, and they're the ones I enjoy having. So before we get any further, if you don't know who Kevin Foster or Grant Fowler are, Kevin Foster has been a routine writer for the Just Fly Sports website, writing so many thoughtful and progressive articles. He is a former NCAA Division I javelin thrower. He's also training for the 2021 Olympic trials in the sport. He's the owner of the Javelin Anatomy Instagram page and was previously appearing on this podcast on episode 164. Grant Fowler is the owner of Fowler Fitness in the Woodlands, Texas. Grant works as a private training and online performance consultant, and he's very well known as a different thinker who has a distinctive nonlinear and adaptable style to his training program design. Grant was recently on the show on episode 190, where he went into a lot of the nuts and bolts of that nonlinear training program. So on this show today, we're going to get into some of the philosophy behind what went into Kevin's program, as well as some ideas on just things like, can you be too holistic in your training program design versus, I guess, being overly isolationist. So some ideas on that. We're going to talk about some ideas on mobility, some ideas on just general strength and capacity as a factor as an athlete moves throughout time, as well as some of the updates or some of the ideas that go into Grant's program, beginners versus intermediate versus advanced, as well as ideas on tapering and so much more. This was a really fun chat with two very forward-thinking young coaches, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. Let's get on to the show. Kevin, Grant, great to have you guys back on the show, dudes. Let's start by chatting a little bit about, it's been probably about a year, maybe a little more, since I talked to either of you. What have you guys been learning lately, especially like when COVID's hit and probably changed some restrictions and things like that? But what have you guys been learning recently since the last time we talked?
Yeah, so it's been a pretty crazy year for me. I think it's been actually over a year now since I did the podcast. And I think one of the things I mentioned was I was gearing up for Tokyo 2020, trying to hit the standard there. So basically since the last podcast, I kind of transitioned from kind of like coach mode back into athlete mode. And actually part of that was getting in touch with Grant and working through his programming. So I was pretty geared up for the 2020 season, and obviously things fell through. So now I'm just kind of like recalibrating, figuring out where I want to go from here. One of the big things for me is just kind of getting back into coach mode a little bit. So I've been working on putting out a little like mobility training program for people who have been just kind of like living in the weight room mindset for, the last X amount of years and ignoring mobility work. I kind of put together a program that kind of works for, all levels. It's like a 3-level training program that just kind of starts at like the beginning basic building blocks of mobility. So stuff like breathing, learning how to breathe, training like isolated joint mobility, isolated joint strength, and then kind of just progressing through all the way into stuff like, like coordination, co-contractions, training like fascial connectedness, and then even getting into quote unquote like extreme displays of flexibility. So stuff like dropping into splits and full back bridges and stuff like that. I think it's a great time to be working on this stuff, where maybe you've been locked out of the gym, you still don't have all the equipment you need. But it's kind of the whole system is kind of what I've been using over the last 6 months since I've been out of the gym, but it's kind of just what I've been using to kind of take care of my body after beating it up throughout college through 3 surgeries. So I'm excited to be putting that out. But yeah, man, now I'm still also just back in athlete mode, gearing up for next season, just back into my training. So going to be exciting, kind of moving forward over the next few months.
Yeah, in terms of the mobility too, like have your views, and as a javelin thrower, clearly you need quite a bit of mobility, but have your views on static stretching, how much do you need, or mobility do you truly need, all those things, has that changed really for you in the last year or two?
Yeah, so honestly, I think it hasn't necessarily changed for me, but I think I've just better been able to put it into words. And I think that one of the biggest problems with mobility training, and really honestly, even just any training at all, is there's 2 problems, and they're the same problem really. And it's first, we do too much too soon, and then we don't do enough. So we kind of like go straight into these lifting programs that revolve around powerlifting and Olympic lifting and, max effort sprints and, measuring maximal vertical jumps and, velocity based training, this, that, the other. But we ignore the foundation of isolated joint mobility, right? Getting your hips moving, getting your spine moving, spinal segmentation, strengthening the feet, developing structure through the knees. Like, how do we have these guys who can squat houses but have weak knees? Right? You can squat 400 pounds, but you can't do a sissy squat. You can deadlift a house, but you can't bend up and pick up a pencil without throwing out your back. So it's like we skip these foundational aspects and go straight to these, how you're quote unquote supposed to train, which is pretty much the standard model for most. I mean, I would say like the NCAA training system, but then you get stuck in that system and you never progress beyond that system. So in terms of like mobility work, it's like, yeah, sure, we go right into like, guys will do like hurdle walking drills, walking over the hurdles. We'll do, your standard issue dynamic warm up with the world's greatest lunge stretch, and you'll do the sweeping toe touch stretch. But you never do like the FRC stuff. You never do Dr. Tommy John spinal hygiene. You never do strength through length type weightlifting drills. So we go right into these kind of like integrated forms of mobility, skipping the isolated phases, but then we stay there, right? And it's like, imagine if every track and field athlete on a track team could drop into full splits, or if they could do full back bends or Jefferson curl their body weight. And it's like, there's so much farther we can go with just the human potential of movement. And so it's like, why are we stuck in this training no man's land? So I mean, the mobility program I put together kind of is based around that idea. People might see like the beginner phase and be like, wow, this is way too easy, or this is boring, or I can do more than this. But they're missing the point that they're going to progress through and go all the way to things that they didn't even know was possible for their body to do, right? You can do splits, you can do back bridges, you can Jefferson curl your body weight if you progress there. And I just think that that's like a powerful message that a lot of athletes miss.
Yeah, I like the back bridge and the Jefferson curl have been two that I've been the back bridge, like the wrestler bridge, I've loved forever, especially working with swimmers. I always noticed that the swimmers who have better control of their spines and can do that movement well just tended to be better in the water. They had more bandwidth to work with from a spinal perspective. Do you think though, like, I mean, does everyone on the track team need to do the splits? You know what I'm saying? Like, is that going to make a shot putter or a sprinter how does that play in? Because I think that's a big question, is how much is too much? And then maybe we'll talk about this later, but my question is always, when do you start needing anything other than an extreme ISO to create mobility, if that makes sense? So, Grant, if you want to jump in on this too, and I want to get to you asking Grant, you as well what you've been learning lately. So that's definitely still in the queue here. But if you guys want to chime in on that,
yeah, I mean, just to kind of, I think there's a lot of people that look at training sometimes almost too holistically. I think like that's kind of become the trend now, because there was a point in time where it was almost too reductionist. And so now people are starting to look at things through the lens of holism through everything. And so, you kind of have these people, like, if you look at a lot of like the functional patterns people, it's like, okay, all we're going to do is global movements. You can improve your mobility doing just dynamic global exercise. And I think to some extent that's probably true, but when we talk about really going in and kind of like expediting a very specific goal with a lot of precision, then that's kind of when we need to look at some of the stuff that like Kevin is having people do, where it's a little bit more targeted, and you can kind of do it in conjunction with a lot of the more like global macro type of training that you're doing. And it kind of just helps you're able to integrate some of that more isolated range of motion and some of that more isolated strength kind of into some of these dynamic contexts when you're kind of doing them simultaneously. And so I think a lot of the stuff that, Kevin is talking about, and then even a lot of the stuff that I was kind of having him do in the program, is sort of along those lines, where to some extent we're going to need to approximate some degree of specificity in training if we want our training to carry over maximally to sport. But then we also have to kind of shift focus a little bit and look at, what are some of the smaller things that I need to work on? What are some of the details that I can focus on here to kind of make everything that I'm doing a little bit more effective, if that makes sense?
One thing I think,
Grant, and off that, sorry, Joel, I'll just go ahead. But off that, it's like specific skills, and whatever your sport is, it's made out of specific general adaptations, right? It's like every body has the same system of joints and levers within it, but it's a matter of every sport is going to coordinate that system of joints and levers slightly different. But if you never train and drive those adaptations to be able to move and strengthen the body in those isolated settings, then you're never going to be able to use those in those fully integrated settings. And so, I mean, I think that That's where I think that general versus specific is kind of just not the right argument to be having. Just because, when you really break things down, you're always training for a specific adaptation, but it just might not look quote unquote specific to your sport.
Right. So I think, the general versus specific thing can be a little deceiving because in reality, it really all kind of is the same stuff. It's just on a spectrum, if that kind of makes sense. So I think people see a lot of isolated range of motion. They see isolated feats of strength, like maybe a heavy back squat or a deadlift. To some extent, I think there's a point where that may not be as applicable. It may not be what you need to focus most of your energy and attention on. But I think it would also be false to assume that that type of strength is going to be, or just even range of motion, is going to be completely disconnected from sport because it's quote unquote isolated. There's still going to be some degree of transfer there. And I think a lot of the stuff that we do in the gym is more so about what can we do in the gym to drive a specific outcome most effectively. And then how can we kind of string a lot of those little victories together to kind of improve performance, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of things that we're going to do in the gym that may very well be isolated. If you're doing a bicep curl, obviously that's not usually the way your bicep's going to function in a sport. It's obviously going to be doing a lot of other stuff with other joints and other muscles involved. But even if you are doing a bicep curl, there's still going to be a lot of other things that you're kind of using at the same time. It's not like anything we ever do is like completely or 100% isolated or fragmented.
Yeah, I think those are points too that I think we can bring up, specifically talking with how you guys work together with Kevin's program and the total program and integrating that to javelin performance. I did with the stretching too. I can always, for some reason, I always get hung up on like people doing the splits and stuff like that. Cause I bought Pavel's book, like Relax in a Stretch. I've done that kind of stuff. And I always know when I get up from doing those very long holds, I just feel like if I was to go run, it would feel like the most horribly uncoordinated thing. Cause you just totally messed up the muscle receptivity. Of course, then you go the next day, probably fine, right? Like, so I tend to base, you have a short-term thinking and then well, this is probably fine the next day, but it's maybe not necessarily range you needed or didn't need. And I think about doing like an extreme iso lunge though, or extreme iso push-up. Like maybe I'll give two different examples. Like an extreme iso lunge, depending how long I did. Now, if I just did it for like 30 seconds a minute, I'll get up and I'll be okay. Like give me a little bit, I can go and I can do some running. I actually feel pretty good. It might feel better. If I do it for 5 minutes, I'm probably going to hobble around for like the next 10 minutes. And who even knows, like the cute effects, right? But I do know I can feel the effect of those lunges. Like we do a hill workout once a week here at Cincinnati. And I feel good. Like I feel it. And I can like really feel the effects of that. Maybe not from a mobility standpoint. Maybe it's more a movement. Maybe it's just the front hip and the back hip and they're working in opposition more as I sink down into it. I don't know. I guess my question is how much range is too much range in some of these feats? Like a side splits, for example. And I'm sure there's respect to sport. Like javelin, you probably need a lot. Like was it Vetter? Like that huge split, right? Like it's through that 97. Man, that's like crazy. I bet that guy's got a ton of mobility. But does a sprinter need that much? Does a basketball player? You know what I'm saying? Like where do we determine what's appropriate in those scenarios?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first big thing to kind of address is just that stretching, generally speaking, is just super, super, super like misunderstood. And there's just a stigma attached to it, right? Where everybody hears stretching and kind of like the first thing they'll say is, I mean, I'll stretch and then I'll go try to run and I feel horrible. But then it's like, okay, then try it differently. Don't stretch right before you run. Do like a session at night and see how you feel the next day. You'll probably feel totally fine. So it's just figuring out how it fits into your own specific training program. But then the how much range is too much range. I think that stretching goes hand in hand with relaxation. And I think that too many athletes lack the ability to turn off their muscles. And, that's what stretching is, right? You train to turn off your muscles. You sit in the stretch and you're feeling the line of tension and you're trying to relax into it. So in terms of that, I think relaxation is the single most underappreciated element of athleticism just out there right now. And if you watch any elite guy, whether it's Usain Bolt in the 100 meters, Jonathan Edwards in the triple jump, or Jan Zalesny in the javelin throw, the one thing they all have in common are elite levels of relaxation, where they drive the movement proximally and the energy transfers outwards through their limbs through that relaxation. And, I think looking at it from that lens of energy transfer instead of, force production of the limbs explains a lot of their elite level performances, just in terms of, one example I used pretty recently is like, okay, a catapult can launch something far, right? The catapult represents the muscle driven athlete who just, the more force you put in, the more force you get out. But then the whip can break the sound barrier through elasticity, relaxation, and sequencing. And so to me, that's where I see stretching kind of fitting into things. And, I think saying how much range is too much range is maybe a little bit of a kind of like myopic point of view, where if you're putting it into a well-rounded program with, in a well-rounded strength program, a well-rounded athletic development program, you're not going to turn into a rag doll, right? You're still going to have the coordination and the skills and everything else. You're just going to have a little more range with it. And I think until you experience that range yourself, it's impossible to really like put into words the different feel that it brings to movement.
Yeah. And I think too, just, with what Kevin said, that was kind of a big part of our programming is, anytime you ask a how much is too much question, it's really more important to consider like time management than it is worrying about whether you're going to confer some type of negative benefit to sport. I think the biggest issue is how much is too much is usually a question of, am I spending all day in the gym working on this one thing so much to the extent that I don't have time to do anything else? So if we're talking about maximal strength, we've had people on the program that continue to get stronger probably for the past 3 or 4 years. And it's not, we maximal strength train people for probably 20 or 30 minutes, maybe at the most. And then even in between that, we're doing a lot of other things, like we're combining jumps with that. We might be doing some breathing drills and stuff. So it's, people will ask the same question with strength training. It's like, how much is too much? And I don't really think it matters necessarily unless you're in the gym, like just squatting for an hour. You find a lot of people that get to the point where, okay, you have a 500-pound squat, and to get to 600, you need to spend 45 to 60 minutes just squatting, right? I think the answer to that question is once you're spending a disproportionate amount of time focusing on one thing, that's when I think too much is too much, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, Grant, and off that too, I think it's really important that you can't separate that question from the methods that you use to actually attain the levels of whatever attribute you're going for, right? Where, there's very, very time consuming to get strong. There's very, very time consuming ways to get flexible, or there's very, very time efficient ways to get flexible. And that's
exactly.
where you do have to look at it from that holistic, almost like connecting the Venn diagram kind of approach and find that middle connecting point.
Yeah. And I think with a lot of the stuff that we did in your training, Kevin, it was kind of along those lines where maybe we were doing everything that we needed to get you stronger, but it wasn't all in one session. So you'll have a lot of people that, it's like if you're doing powerlifting, you might go in and do a back squat, and then you're going to do some specific auxiliaries to improve the back squat. So you might do like a pin squat or, something along those lines. What we kind of did is we took a lot of that same stuff, but we just spaced it out over the weeks. So you're getting a lot of the same things that you would need to continually drive your strength higher, but you're not cramming it all into one session, if that makes sense. So the time efficiency thing is really important to consider as well. And that's kind of the way the program is set up. The way it's set up is so that we can train a variety of different things without having to cram it all in one session.
Yeah, well, Grant, that's the funny thing is when I was going through your programming, I got stronger every week, basically. And I don't think there was never a deload period either. It was just kind of like built in just through the variability. But, you know, it's funny because I still remember that first week where I was training, and, you know, it was after, I think, just 2 workouts and an off day. I think I texted you and I was like, dude, I feel like a monster during my track workout. And, you know, I think you just kind of nailed it right there, where it's like the variability is super high, but the consistency is also super high. And the intensity is there, but the volume's also there, right? The strength is there, but the elasticity is also there. And so you combine all those elements in that right time management approach, and you're able to hit all of those things basically, you know, every workout for the most part, and to some extent or another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure, Joel, you're probably familiar with this when you're programming track workouts, but there becomes a point where you kind of think, and some people do block periodization, and if that's what you do, then this line of thought probably doesn't apply as much. But you kind of get to a point where it's like, how am I going to do all of the things that I need to do, right, to be successful? And I think a lot of people have a hard time with that because they think they need to do the same thing every week to get good. When in reality, you can do, I think it was Mike Mincer that kind of popularized, you know, the whole like high intensity bodybuilding style training. There's a lot of people that argue about whether that was the ideal way to go about building muscle. But I think if you kind of take some of those concepts and you apply them to sports, you know, it's like you might do one really high intensity workout, and then I think it's like for another 14 days, you wait basically 14 days to repeat that same high intensity workout. And so that's a pretty good amount of time. That's about 2 weeks. And so I think people have this idea drilled in their head that they always need to be practicing and doing the same things over and over. And to some extent, you need to, if you're trying to throw a baseball really well, you need to practice throwing the baseball, right? But there becomes a point where, you know, it's like, how am I doing this too much to the point where I'm actually regressing now? And how much do I really need to do this one thing? Or how often do I really need to do this one thing to get good at it, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I think that's been one of the most powerful things in my, I guess, training arsenal in the last, 5, 10, probably about somewhere between 6 and 8 years ago, I'd say that really started to get in my system of creating training. And I think a lot of it, if you ask me what I've learned from maybe like the last even 3 months, I think a lot of that has to do with confidence, because I think it's anxiety that keeps us tied to thinking we have to do something over and over again repeatedly every single week. And there is a confidence.
Absolutely.
There's a confidence in like, no, I'm good on that. Like, and then 2, just the rhythm and flow of how the body can learn and adapt depending on your adaptation scheme. But I remember, I think it came out of the DB Hammer book or somewhere in that world. And it was a scheme I kind of kept with me. I always liked. It was almost like French contrast, but over a 2-week period, in the sense of like you had a Monday where you had a heavy squat. You had a Thursday or Friday with a depth jump type thing. You had a Monday coming back with like a speed squat. And then you had a Friday with like a fast, like a rate plyo, like a fast hurdle hops, or I don't think there was no fast hurdle hops in that program, but something that's more like a fast lateral barrier hop for time, something that's puts more of a time frame. And so you're just slowly going down. And I think what people, even outside of the specific recovery, I guess you could call it frame, there's also the mental emotional recovery, because you always want to set someone up to PR every time they do these things, unless you're in Bondarchuk land, which it's like, you know, there's those parallels, right? But so I want to get into this. Actually, I just want to close out some thoughts, because we didn't really, I guess, close out just my parting shot on this, the mobility thing, because I want to get into how you guys got together and where you were, Kevin, before and after the training programs, and get into some nuts and bolts there. But based off what you guys are saying, I do like, you know, we can make things overly reductionist. We can make them overly holistic. I think with the mobility, I guess I think about, I like what you said, Kevin, just like letting sensation be your guide. We tend to be too quantitative too often. It's hard to put a number on stretching outside of you did it for this long and what were these results. But I do think that, you know, be it an extreme ISO or some other stretch you hold, knowing the short-term feeling, like I like doing like different dynamic mobility and then go sprint and see how it impacted you. And then so know the short term, and then also be mindful of how you felt the next day, the day after, and those types of, I just think that because I do think maybe our views may differ a little bit on max mobility, those types of things, and that's fine. But I guess maybe if we had a common ground, I'd say it's like you said, like what am I like on the day, and what recording, and what am I feeling while I'm doing this, being very mindful, because I think we are not mindful enough. And then noting the next day and just noting differences. And I guess that's with all training, but hopefully that wasn't too simplistic in what I kind of took from it, at least what our common grounds are.
Yeah. No, I think that you just nailed it with the mindfulness aspect, where that's such a lost art in training. And we tend to approach all training sessions with that weight room mentality of more, harder, turn up the music. And we've just become so disconnected to our bodies. And I think that, training mobility is your chance to, set aside a separate session and work on mindfulness, like train mindfulness and get back in touch with your body, find the lines of tension. Learn that your hips can rotate. How many athletes don't even know that their hips can rotate? And, learn how to breathe, focus on your breath. Like, there's so much you can take away from it that goes beyond just the range of motion. So I think that's a really great point you just made there.
Yeah, I agree with all that. That's awesome. Yeah, and I've been meaning, I need to do more shows on mindfulness anyways. It's like a topic that's been in my head. So, well, cool. Well, let's go to basically how did you guys connect in regards to training? Kevin, what have you been doing? Grant, what was your mindset in setting something up for Kevin? And tell me a little bit about you guys' collaboration together.
Yeah. So where I was just before I started, me and Grant, we've been talking on Instagram for pretty much since I started my page. We're just kind of like two peas in a intellectual pod in terms of how we think and approach things. So we've just been messaging back and forth since probably the last couple of years. And I was at a point, so the training I had been doing, I was pretty much in coach mode for my first post-collegiate year. So I was trying to find the absolute minimum effective dose of training. And basically the first half of my first year post-collegiate, it was basically athletic truth group exercises meets easy strength system. And so it was just a lot of strength through length, athletic truth group exercises, doing 2 sets of 5, just in and out of the gym, just pure business. And then I kind of moved into Ido Portal body weight stuff, like pistol squats, shrimp squats, crawling type stuff. And then the year ended and I was like, all right, I'm going all in on Tokyo 2020. So I'm going to go back into athlete mode, and what better guy to call than Grant? So I hit him up and it's just kind of man, I'm ready to start training on your program. What do you got for me?
Yeah. So I think, kind of going into, because he sort of detailed a lot of the things that he was doing before. And so I think this program was good for him because it was sort of a little bit of all of that stuff kind of, combined into one. And so that's the problem that I think a lot of people try to either program hop or they try to program combine. And, if you're trying to combine two people's programs, it's sometimes going to be difficult. I'm not saying that you can't necessarily work on other things on the side. Obviously, there were things that Kevin kind of did on his own, certain things that he knew he needed to attain for his sport. And he kind of understood his goals enough to obviously do a lot of training on the side that he needed to do specifically. But when it came to our stuff, it was, we touched on pretty much everything just enough that, you don't, a lot of people, I think they follow somebody's speed program and they follow somebody's power building program. And then they're doing somebody's bodybuilding program to get bigger biceps. And it's they try to mash all of this stuff into one program and they're in the gym for 4 hours. And then they're not even getting the adaptation that they're really looking for. And so with athletes, obviously there's going to be, I would say for the most part, most athletes need to be faster. That's kind of the main thing. But then there's obviously things that are going to complement that, like building muscle to some extent, getting stronger. And so the minimum effective dose is kind of hard to determine. I don't think we'll ever be able to fully establish what that actually is. But there's a big difference between going in the gym and squatting for 60 minutes versus you're going in there for 20 minutes, doing some squats, doing some jumps maybe with it, and then getting out. So a lot of the stuff that we did kind kind of touched on everything, but it wasn't to the extent that he wasn't able to also do some of his own training on the side and a lot of the stuff that he felt like he needed to do as well. And so that's kind of the premise behind how I train pretty much all of my athletes as well, is that you kind of have this base template for the most part, and we're pretty much touching on everything to some extent to varying degrees each week.
Yeah, so there were two big things that I loved about your programming, Grant. The first thing was just, obviously I was doing the minimal effective dose before, and your program was more of a no stone unturned maximal gain type program. So it was kind of flipping the script on that. But the other part was that your program included a lot of stuff that, could be considered quote unquote javelin specific, like the long range of motion strength work, like training awkward angles, training end range strength. And then my favorite part was actually, I think I actually told you about this, but I call it maybe like the collision training, where we would set up the machines to kind of do like high rep, high force, elastic kind of training, like upper body plyometric type stuff. And that played a huge role in, I think I described it to you as like, it just felt like I developed structure in like my throwing arm that I had never had before. And so I thought that was cool. I had never really done that before.
Before we get any further, Kevin, actually tell me a little bit about the results that you had, like before and after, because I know you're hitting a lot of like lift PRs, because I before we just get through the whole program and then say, oh, well, what are the results? I think it's important to note, like, there was substantial. So tell me a little bit about how it impacted your lifts and your throws.
Yeah. So the big measurements that I was using at that point, so for throws, my short approach throws, just like a 3 crossover throw, went up by about 5 meters. Granted, that had always been kind of one of my weak points as a thrower, was short approach, kind of more like force-driven javelin throws. And so that really filled in that gap where, normally I would 3 crossover throw like 60 meters. Now I was doing 65 meters. The other big thing was 2K ball throws. So 2 kilogram ball throws are kind of like one of the big metrics of, it's one of like the finish metrics of, transfer to javelin throw. And my 2K ball throw went up by about 4 meters. I went from like easily under 30 meters to just over 30 meters. So those are just two big things, and those happen in a pretty short time frame. I never actually got to take any full measured practice throws, just because eventually COVID hit, and obviously I'm in Connecticut during the winter, so I never got a chance to actually measure that. But those are kind of like the metrics that I was using during the time that I was training.
Cool. And then lifts obviously got a lot better.
Oh, when I started working with Grant, I didn't even write down my squat PR. I just said, not 315, not 3 plates. But then by the end, I was putting up, it was 4 plates on one of the box squat variations. I can't remember which one. I think it was the parallel.
Cool. So the structure was based, I know, Grant, we talked about this last time, how you do like a different, it's like 3 weeks running, it's like a 21-day cycle kind of, or correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't repeat the same lift for 2 or 3 weeks. Was that similar with Kevin? Like, kind of what was the vibe of what you had him on?
Yeah, it was pretty much the same thing. I think with the max effort lifts, we've changed how we do them just a little bit. It's still pretty similar, but what I had him on was, you would do a squat like week 1, week 2 would be a deadlift. Week 3 might be a different squat variation, or you could even maybe do the same squat, but with chains or something like that. And so, you're getting, you're training basically all of your weak points. Like there's no position that you're going to be weak in. You're doing wide stance, you're doing close stance, you're using chains. And so that kind of goes back to, how do we get people to improve without spending 60 minutes in the gym doing squats? And the way to do that is to provide a lot of variation, so that people always have something that they can improve on. And, it's funny because you kind of have like two sides of the coin where initially you're going to make a lot of progress really fast, probably faster than, really any other type of program that I've seen, just to be completely honest. You're going to jump in your weights pretty fast. And then even when you do get to that point, when you plateau, you're always going to be making some type of continual steady progress. It might be 5 pounds here, 5 pounds there. And the great thing about that is you don't have to go in the gym and spend all day worrying about, okay, what progression system am I going to use this week? Or what exercise do I need to work on to nail this weakness? In some ways, and in a lot of ways, you can actually go into the gym and pick your rep scheme that day if you want. Or even the exercise that you do. Obviously, with Kevin and a lot of the athletes I train, we structure it a little bit more so that they're not repeating certain things too often. So if they come in and do a max one week, we'll probably have them do like a heavy 5 the next week, just so we're not being too redundant. So with the athletes training, I structure it a lot more. But when it comes to my own training, it's really easy to go in the gym, pick an exercise, pick a rep scheme you haven't done in a while, and that's pretty much it. The rest is history. And when you kind of set everything up in that structure, it's really easy to do that, and it's really easy to have a lot of autonomy with your own training and a lot of choice with your own training as well. So if you come in and you feel like I'm just not going to be able to PR on this today, or this just, my back hurts and maybe I need to do something else, there's always something that you can find that's going to fit your specific issue and your specific needs for that day.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, Grant, my training has totally gone in that direction. I used to, in my mid-20s, I'd probably write out my training week for the most part, the general structure. And in my 30s, early 30s, I did a lot of powerlifting programs that took 5 inches off my vertical because I didn't do enough elastic work and various things. But recently, it's kind of like my weeks go. I know I'm following a high-low these days. I could probably get back on a high where it's like a weight day, a plyo day. I did that a lot in my late 20s, early 30s, and still could handle it. And then that's not besides the point. But it's like now I know I have 3 lifting days. And I just know, it's kind of like, I think about it like, I've heard of like Paul Chek doing intuitive eating. Like you walk in the kitchen, what does my body want? Oh, it wants eggs, but being in touch with yourself and kind of knowing what you want. And it has become that. It's kind of like I stepped in there, it's like, I think I need to hex bar deadlift today. I think I need to do like a step up variation to connect my feet and hips, and we'll just figure out the set and reps when I get there. And it's definitely like I've gotten in better for a lot of reasons, but I've gotten in better physical condition by a long shot than I have been in the past. And I'm doing a lot of holistic health and recovery things, and maybe we can talk about that on the back end. But I feel like once you know the game, and it kind of reminds me of Corey Schlesinger, how he sets up with his athletes. Like they have at least when he was at Stanford, he showed me they have like a big touch TV screen. Here's your 3 items. You can do these 3 squats. You can do these 3 types of benches, or one of these 3. You get to pick. And then it's almost like teaching people to fish more and more as they get more intuitive. Like maybe you have to start with one if it's the athlete who just started, but maybe eventually you can get to the point where it just becomes more intuitive over time.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of people aren't ready to train that intuitive. So you kind of have to structure things a little bit more in the beginning. But as you get to a certain point, I think a lot of people can and should get to that point where they understand how to set up their training, and how to do it in a way that isn't going to, obviously detract from their progress. So like there's some people, if you gave a beginner, a plan and you told them, okay, you can pick whatever you want, they're going to pick the same things over.
Yeah,
and over,
they don't know enough.
So you
things,
have Yeah, so you have to have a certain amount of structure, and you have to say, okay, like, I know you don't like doing this, but you really need to. And so that's kind of why, we may still be doing a squat. It's not like you're going to get out of doing a squat, but if your back hurts, we might do squats with chains, right? So you have to get to that point where, you're intuitive enough to do the stuff that you need to do to still improve, but you can change it up just a little bit to kind of meet your daily and weekly needs, if that makes sense.
I think it's interesting. I think it was Evan Pycon who was telling me this, who work with the Moxie monitor and blood oxygen, and talking about how elite level CrossFitters who've been clearly training probably on their own a lot of their training career had just figured out how to end their WOD or their set, like when they reached this point where their lactate would get too high and they would mess themselves up for the next work. Like this subtle art of auto-regulation. And you wonder where, and the lower level CrossFitters, I think, this is me hoping that I'm correct with my memory, but I believe like the intermediate level or the beginner level did not have that amount of self-regulation. They just blasted the set and they couldn't figure out how to like leave enough in the tank so that they were good the next day. And so to me, it's that intuition is probably not necessarily that much different than the, hey, I'm walking into Corey Schlesinger's gym and here's 3 items on the menu and I know which one I need to pick on the day. Stuff like that. I just think the art of training and intuition, an athlete will never get it unless you give them a choice. There's that art in
right.
that selection.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like I like how that flows. I'm just thinking how that flows in that system. So it's basically like, in Grant, it'd be like week 1, pick a squat. It would like then week 2, pick a deadlift. Week 3, pick a squat assistance. Or would that be kind of a flow, a potential flow of that? Because I love the 21-day cycle, the 14-day cycle. It's just, so you're setting it up where there's just a lot of autonomy in that cycle. Not for everybody, but how did that work with you? Or what's your thoughts on that? And then how did that work with you and Kevin?
Yeah, so I think that's a good idea. And again, like that's not exactly what I have my athletes do. They don't necessarily pick, but they do know that they kind of have the option to do something a little different if they're not feeling good. The good thing about the program is they're usually not feeling bad just because of the way it's set up. If you're using chains and you're using bands and you're changing the variation of the squat, it's very unlikely, unless it was like an acute injury or a sports related thing, that you're even going to come into the gym and have those overuse issues. So that's usually not too much of a problem. When it comes to my own training, it's a little bit more pick and choose. But I think it just kind of depends on, the person that you're working with. And then with Kevin, pretty much everything that was in the program was laid out for him. Was there anything that you ever really changed, Kevin?
No, I was just going to say, I didn't even really need to be super intuitive with my training because I just would read the paper, do it, and felt great. So that was cool.
Yeah. And that's the great thing about it is it's almost like I guess you could say, like, if you don't know how to train intuitive, that's a good place to start, because it's kind of, it takes into account the principles of what intuitive training is without you having to think about it, which sounds kind of funny because obviously, like, intuitive, that's the idea behind intuitive training. But when you kind of just look at it from like the sets, reps, exercises perspective, it would look almost like somebody came in there and said, okay, I'm going to do this today because my back hurts, and I'm going to do this next week because I haven't done that in a while. So you get a lot of those benefits. And then obviously, and with some of my more advanced athletes, like I have some guys that train with me now, and a lot of those guys will kind of change things up on the spot sometimes. So again, it just kind of depends. I don't think that you always have to be super intuitive with it. But that definitely is an option, which a lot of programs, don't give you that option. If you come in, it's like, we got to do 80% today, right? You got to add 5 pounds. And that's, if you can't do it, you can't do it, and that's that, if that makes sense.
I think that something I wanted to mention before I got too far is I think that there is that line between the power choice is awesome. But if there's too much choice, I think maybe Dan John has talked about this too, where it's like, just almost where you have to reduce and simplify and just have to do something. Or the power of the power of I think this is more present, like I said, with novice athletes. As you get more advanced, you should have more choice and that. But I also think that even in advanced, like let's say I'm training track athletes, maybe I can give them a little bit of choice. Like if we're doing some workouts in the off season, and I know we should probably touch a certain amount of volume, maybe I give them some choice in like maybe the mode of the exercise a little bit. But there has to be like the reckoning, you can't get out of like just work, I think, through choice. Like there has to be that volume, but then maybe perhaps later in the season or in the peaking, they could have more ownership over the actual like volumes and things like that and that type of thing. But I think that there always needs to be like a funneling into something more solid where there's less choice and you just have to do it and get over it and emotionally work your way through it. Unless that's there at some point in a program, I think it never challenges you on a certain level or that level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, completely. I feel like, it's a really fine balance between structure and then variability.
So in the program, so Kevin, you wouldn't repeat a lift then to like once every 4 weeks you would see the same lift or how often? Because I know you said you're PRing like all the time. So it was like every time you got back to lift, you PR'd, you see a new lift or see the same lift every 4 weeks, something like that?
Yeah. So I think it was a different lift every week, but the other part of it too is it would be like a different rep PR. So it was like, okay, maybe week 1 I would do like box squat to parallel for 5 reps or something like that. But then maybe I actually can't even remember if I repeated the same lift or not. But I remember it was a different rep PR every week, which was really cool. Just because everybody wants to hit a PR, right? You just feel good. It makes you feel like a beast, and so that was something I really liked was, even whether it was a different exercise or a different rep PR or whatever, you always had an opportunity to hit a new best. And I think that there's something pretty powerful about that, even just in terms of like, covering different personalities and stuff, or like, some guys really thrive on the variation, but some guys really thrive on the competition aspect, and it kind of touched on both for me, and I think that was a big part of just why things really resonated with me.
Yeah, I think that the power, the more people I talk to, the more programs I explore. Just that, I mean, I don't know who the first person to come up with that. Maybe the bigger, faster, stronger was it, with that. And I know Tony Holler's written on that in the context of speed training, and I think that it is interesting to think, if everything works in pendulums and cycles, are there, seasoned strength coaches listening to this who are like, oh, bigger, faster, stronger had this, like maybe there's nothing new under the sun in some sense. Maybe I was recreating versions of it, right? But I think if you're not doing, I always think of where this fits on the polarity too. Like on one end, you have just solid, steady work, like Bondarchuk type. You're just going with the program, and you aren't going to see the real result until the end of the adaptation cycle. Maybe you did 25 sessions and you hit your peak, and now you're kind of going down again. And maybe it's the environment and the energy too that's an important part of that, trusting that system. But it seems like the fail safe is just, can I come in and PR today? Can I facilitate competition? Can I PR every week? And it also makes me think about, Grant, I was going to ask you this, is how, maybe we talked about this last time, maybe we didn't, but do you find yourself often, I suppose it depends on the group, but like steering the workout so that the athlete can hopefully PR? Like would you steer what you're doing on the day, be like, oh, here's something that you can PR, and or how do you treat that, or what's your philosophy on that?
Sometimes, yeah. So it's not, I wouldn't say that PRing necessarily is the end all be all. It's definitely set up to allow them to do that and make that incremental progress. So sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. I just put up a post on this, but yesterday we did, I think it was like a depth to hurdle jump. And so a lot of people PR'd on their depth to hurdle jump. And then a lot of people were kind of struggling on it, myself included, because I did the same workout. And so we switched it up to where some people kind of did like a run up jump. Some people did like a lateral jump. And it was funny because a lot of people were really struggling on that depth jump, and then they switched to the hurdle hop and just destroyed it. So, you would think, okay, I'm going to get higher on the depth to hurdle jump than I am a lateral hurdle hop. But I think sometimes mentally, if there's something that's kind of getting in the way there, that can hold back your performance. And so if you change the exercise up a little bit and kind of find something that you can get a good rhythm and a good flow going on, sometimes you can PR on something that may, or even have a better performance on something that would be maybe a little bit harder on paper. So sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. It kind of just depends on the exercise that we're doing and just how everybody's feeling that day.
Yeah, there's always going to be a huge art, the art of element to it. You're never going to have that exact equation to say, when do you not need to PR? When do you need to PR? Especially once I think you get into the more versus 7-day cycles where you're going to see the same exercises sets every week. And to me, I think that probably works really well for beginners because you're going to PR every week pretty much no matter what if you've never done this stuff. But at some point, you're going to have to see that every 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But even then, there's an art form to selecting what you're going to actually do and if you're going to go for it or not, or just build or move beyond it.
Yeah, and I only think there is a time and place to have things that are a little bit more structured. So if you look at block periodization, you look at peaking and tapering, or like some of the Bondarchuk stuff, I think a lot of that stuff can work kind of as you get closer to your competition, because you want to sometimes remove a little bit of the variability. Obviously, you may still kind of have some of that on the back burner just to kind of keep things, just to keep a lot of your progress on some of those other exercises and whatnot. At some point, I think it's important to have certain periods. They're not going to be long. It might be leading up to a competition or something where maybe you kind of reduce the variability a little bit and you do kind of a more structured peaking or, a tailored type of a program to really drive home a specific goal. I don't think that should necessarily be the foundation of your program, though.
Yeah, I know the Bondarchuk system was very good at getting people to taper at the right time, because you know exactly how many sessions you have that run up, or you had like the Charlie Francis 10-day taper and these structured things that can get you from A to B at that right time. Because I imagine, like a more fluid system that's not so linear, it's going to be a lot harder to say, I'm going to peak here. Like, this day is going to be the best. Of course, you could always say, well, you just feed the athlete something they don't need for X amount of time. And of course, they're going to be better at the end of it, if you're tapering down. But yeah, there's always shades of it, right? There's always kind of different. How do you approach like taper periods, Grant? If someone's, you're saying, okay, we're not going to repeat this lift for X amount of weeks, but then someone's got like a combine coming up. What goes in your head when it's like, okay, now we're going to get ready. We want to be the best at XYZ date.
So sometimes it can be a little difficult, especially if you have a lot of athletes in the same room. We have a lot of different people that come in that are playing different sports. Their seasons are at different times and stuff. So we kind of have two programs. We have like the in-season program, and then we have more of an off-season program. The off-season program is, in a lot of ways, kind of like an extended taper or peak. It's not really going to look anything like anything out of super training or like a Bondarchuk type of system. It's just going to be a little less variability. We're going to focus a little bit more on certain speed and plyo exercises. Obviously, will reduce some of the higher impact stuff. But really, it's just kind of reducing the variability a bit, kind of making certain components of the training a little bit more consistent. Mm. And then if we have somebody that's going to, maybe they need a peak for a very specific competition, sometimes it's hard because a lot of the kids will be doing stuff at school, or they're doing, a coach's workout. So what I really do is I kind of just step back a little bit. We sort of just reduce a lot of the stuff they're doing in the gym. We might microdose some more sprints or microdose specific jump variations just to kind of keep their nervous system, on and ready, if that sort of makes sense. If they're a day or two out from a competition, we might do, I don't know if you're familiar with some of Christian Thibodeau's like neural charge workouts.
Yeah.
Sometimes we'll do stuff that's kind of along those lines. But it's really not too complicated. It's just the same training, just a little less variation and a little more of the stuff that they're going to be doing in sport, which is obviously sprints, jumps, and some of that high velocity stuff.
Cool. So in summer, you'd say like when with off-season building time, you open variability up so that each workout can really be more intense. Because you get longer to recover from that specific workout. You can PR more often, and then when it's time to hone that down into a specific skill, less variability. You're going to see a little bit more of the same thing. Everything gets a little more specific to the skill. That would be a good summary.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's always going to be a little bit of variability just on the back burner so that you can kind of maintain some of that strength and maintain some of those foundational qualities that you used and built to support some of the more specific skills.
Would that variability be in, like, I know Bush Sexier talks about keeping things really simple on the big days, but then the recovery days being a ton of variability. Would that be where you're getting it a little bit more on that run up, like the recovery days, or are you still getting it on the some of the bigger days?
Yeah, it would be a lot more variability within the accessory exercises.
Yeah.
I think sometimes there can be a certain point where if you have too much variability with your big lifts and some of those really high stress exercises, they can make you a little too sore. If you haven't done that stimulus or you haven't been exposed to that stimulus in a while. So we sort of cut back the variability on some of the higher intensity stuff. And then we kind of up it on more of the lower intensity, auxiliary based movements.
Cool. Kevin, any parting shots on what we've been talking about with the training, the outcomes, and the flow of the program as you work through it?
I guess one thing that just kind of came to mind just while you guys were talking about the periodization is, I think for a lot of athletes, we get so caught up on peaking that we never actually adapt, if that makes sense, where, we're so worried about getting ready and feeling good after every workout that we never really put in, the high intensity accumulation week after week after week after week. And, I guess that was something that was really eye-opening for me. Just work through Grant's program was, I was putting in the work, more work than I had in the last 2 years. And yet I was improving every week and I was feeling good and powerful and athletic. And I think that, there's just something powerful to that of, you shouldn't be coming back the same athlete year after year after year, right? You should be taking the time to build these foundations of strength and variability and intensity and volume and all of that. So it's just food for thought, I guess, but definitely just something to keep in mind for a lot of athletes, especially the younger ones, the freshman, the sophomore, right? Do you really want to peak for your first meet of the year so that you can get, 6th place at so-and-so meet at the cost of, fully developing yourself come senior year?
And then to even add just a little bit to that, I think a lot of people have in their mind that they can't hit a PR or a really good performance if they've had a hard training week. When we were doing those jumps, I think we did at least over 100 jumps or so, over the hurdles. And I mean, that's close to double what we would normally do in terms of volume and intensity. And people were pretty tired by the end of it, but we didn't hit our PRs until the very end. And I think competition, engagement, a lot of the beliefs that we have about training can either propel us forward or they can hold us back. So you can easily nocebo yourself into thinking that, oh, I just had a hard training week, or I just did a really hard workout and, man, that was really tough. So next week is going to suck. Or I squatted heavy, so I'm not going to be able to sprint fast this week. And I think to some extent, there's some truth to that. Obviously, we want to structure certain components of our training at certain times of the year to facilitate certain goals better. But I think we've kind of blown some of that a little out of proportion just in terms of what we're actually capable of doing and what we're not.
Yeah, I found the more kind of open in terms of variability the training becomes, I see that more almost in that, because I think some of it being psychological, you're just not working quite the same pathway for whatever reason. And in the hard workouts, just distributing the types of hard workouts that you do, like you were talking last podcast, Grant, about doing iso lunges with holding dumbbells in your hands and versus not doing it. I mean, the mental variability of, if I had to do a 5-minute iso lunge every week, like that's a lot of adrenaline secretion, as Christian Thibodeau talks about it. But if I get to break it up a little bit, this is going to be hard. It's just going to be different. It just definitely makes a difference. And
off that, Joel, off that, I feel like if you can, right, there's the physical adaptation, but then there's the psychological adaptation where if you're not scared of that 5-minute lunge anymore, week after week after week, then I think you're a better athlete for that. I think that you're a more confident, more powerful athlete, and you can channel that energy into other training.
Yeah, I completely agree. I know we were talking a little bit about that before the show, Kevin, and I felt it. I had a hill run this morning, and I smashed my old times. And I had just done a 5-minute iso lunge the week before, and I was honestly keeping almost the sense of victory of that lunge with me, like as I was going through these hill runs. It just, I could feel what I had overcome to hit that time, and I mean the pain of the hill run was nowhere, not even close. It wasn't even a tenth of that iso lunge. It's just emotionally, but it's nice. If I would have had to do a 5-minute iso lunge again this week, I don't know, but just being able to channel that into the hill run, it was good stuff. I have one last thing, and that's it was as per the training program, and you guys mentioned a little bit before doing too much, too little of something, and so with the strength, so Kevin, you clearly had gained a ton of strength. Now, if you had continued and on, I don't know how long you guys did this program, but let's just say you did it for a year, or in your mind moving forward, like you have this strength, you have these lifts. If we look at transfer of training tables, your lifts are more in range of, a 80 meter or whatever thrower. How are you approaching I know you're still putting time into in these skills. Is there any modifications, thoughts, ideas now that a higher level to this set has been attained as you move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think just going back to, just those kind of like self-imposed limitations I had been putting on myself, I feel just a lot more confident to, throw harder, throw more often. Like the base of general strength that I've gotten has allowed me to massively increase the amount of specific work I do, which I actually was expecting kind of like the opposite initially going into it, where, I thought, oh, okay, well, if I'm going to be doing upper body work, I'm probably going to have to cut down on my throwing stuff. But it was actually totally the opposite. And so I think that's kind of been like my big takeaway is just always maintain that level of general strength and structure. And, whatever it was, always have that in order to funnel into the specific work that I'm doing. And it's like everybody says, it's like the best athlete is the one who can find a way to train their sport the most often, right? The more sessions you can do specific work in, the more hours you spend doing your specific skill, the better you're going to be. And obviously javelin is a very high stress skill. So, you have to put in the work to build that physical foundation in order to do that.
I know one of the stories I remember is, so Taro Kamaki had thrown that 91 meters. I don't know how long ago that was, but it's like almost every year after that 91, it was like the next year was 90, then it was 89. It's almost like he lost a meter a year for so many years. And then Jan Zalesny started coaching him, and he said, like, the first thing he said, or one of the first things, was he's just become too rigid, too much heavy weight. And you've seen those like highlight tapes of Pitt. I mean, that guy's a monster, like just the absolute monster in the weight room, a beast. And so I guess my question is at what point, how do you prevent from that happening in light of what we're talking about? And because obviously the physical prep has given you the work capacity. Awesome. Like how do you mitigate not that trail of degradation?
You stretch. No, you just have to address it from a holistic approach, right? So, you understand what the strength work is doing to you in terms of, obviously you're getting the good adaptations, but you have to also be aware of the quote unquote negative adaptations, and, just put in the work in the other areas of athleticism to negate that. So, make sure you maintain your mobility throughout, the heavy lifting stuff. Make sure you don't lose touch with, internal rotation and, spinal segmentation. Make sure you're maintaining some level of running volume to maintain your elasticity, keep your feet strong. There's enough, information and programs out there to find different ways to do that. It's just about finding what fits best into the bigger picture of the whole training plan.
Yeah, I think what Kevin said there is important, because I think that's a mistake that a lot of people make when they claim that, lifting weights made them slower, or building muscle made them slower. It's a lot of these people are going into the gym and they're doing these insane volumes, or they're doing things that are, detracting from their ability to effectively play their sport. And so if you kind of take all these things and you put them together into a balanced program, I really don't think you'll have too many issues. To some extent, there are things with maximal strength training. You're going to get certain tendon architecture adaptations that may not be super specific to, high velocity activities and, elastic related stuff. But you can really look at that, one of two ways. And the way I choose to look at it is, if you're doing some maximal strength, but you're also, say, throwing and running 5 times a week, you're just going to give yourself a little bit more balance in terms of, I can't remember who it was. I think it was Keith Barr. It was somebody that Jake had on, and he was saying that, some of that heavier maximal strength training is kind of good, just because your tendons are viscoelastic. So they have components that are going to respond well to heavy strength training, and they're going to have components that respond well to things like elasticity. So if you're predominantly doing a lot of elastic stuff, the strength training is really just going to, instead of detracting or deteriorating from your throwing, it's just going to give you a little bit more balance in terms of, what am I doing, or what am I doing a lot of already, and what maybe do I need a little bit more of? And so that's kind of what a lot of the training that we do in the gym is centered around. Is it's just kind of giving athletes certain strategies and certain options that maybe they may not be getting a lot of in sport. And so if you look at improving posture, if you look at improving, joint range of motion, it all kind of comes back to that. It's like, what does this athlete predominantly use, and what could we maybe give them a little bit more of on the opposite side of the spectrum?
Yeah, sounds good. I know we've kind of run quite a course here on this chat so far today, and I think our time is finally up, but it's good talking. It's good talking about these topics, and I like just digging into case studies too. I don't think we do enough case studies on the show, so I'm happy that you guys are both able to give some of your time and talk about these things. I originally wanted to hit recovery and supplements a little bit, but maybe next time. But I appreciate you guys.
Sheila's eating red light.
Yeah. What in red light? For the
red light therapy and Shilajit. That's it. Right there.
Yeah, just those two. Okay, there you go. There's our last. I'll put that as a topic with like 20 seconds to go on the show notes. So that'll be awesome. All right, guys. Well, hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks a lot, Joel.
That finishes up another show. Thank you guys so much for listening. I really appreciate all of you who taken the time to use this as a learning platform. If you enjoy it, you can definitely help us out by leaving a rating or review on iTunes or Stitcher. And before we get out of here, I wanted to give one last shout out to our sponsor, simplyfaster.com. They've been a longtime supporter of this show, so we cannot thank them enough for their support. You can help them out by going and checking out their blog or their online store, which has so many pieces of the best of in sport tech, data, and then training tools. All right, that does it. We'll see you guys next week.